formed over years of balancing family, study, and work. He brewed a modest cup of black coffee, careful not to wake his younger brother Malik, who had just finished a night shift at the warehouse. The apartment was small but spotless, every surface speaking to a man who valued order, clarity, and purpose. Their mother had moved in with their aunt after their father passed, but Desmond insisted on holding on to the apartment. It was his way of anchoring what was left of their world, of keeping some part of his father's memory alive. At 29, Desmond had grown into the kind of man most would call quiet strength. He carried himself with a composed demeanor, always with a pressed shirt, polished shoes, and his thick locks tied neatly behind his head. His appearance wasn't about vanity, it was about dignity. Every morning before leaving the house, he checked the mirror not for flaws, but for readiness. He represented more than himself now. As a law clerk working under Judge Raymond Shaw, Desmond was steadily climbing toward his dream of becoming a judge, a dream his father once whispered about with pride, back when the world still made a little more sense. His briefcase, a gift from his father when he was accepted into law school, held tightly organized notes, court records, and a worn leather-bound journal where Desmond scribbled thoughts on justice, morality, and legal philosophy. He treated it as something sacred, not for sentimentality alone, but because it reminded him that real change didn't happen through shouting. It happened through structure, through patience, through outlasting the system that tried to break you. That evening, Desmond stayed later at the courthouse than usual, helping prep files for an upcoming custody trial. He left just past 9, exhausted but content. The streets were quieter than usual, city lights humming with a familiar flicker. He wasn't far from home when flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. His heart didn't race, not yet. He checked his speed. He hadn't been speeding. His turn signal had been used. Everything had been done by the book. He slowed to a stop on the shoulder, putting the car in park. Hands on the wheel. Windows rolled down halfway. He'd read the stories, knew the protocols, knew that doing everything right didn't always protect you, but it was a start. The officer who approached had a heavy walk, the kind that broadcasted authority before words were even spoken. Officer Ronald Briggs was a name Desmond recognized. Briggs had been in the news a few times, commended for bravery during a hostage situation, once shown on television embracing the mayor during a police awards ceremony. But there were other stories too, ones that didn't make the front page, ones about how he handled stops in predominantly black neighborhoods. Desmond remembered hearing about an incident 2 years ago that mysteriously never made it to court. Internal Affairs had found no fault. Briggs didn't begin with a greeting. Instead, he asked for license and registration with clipped automatic sternness. Desmond complied without hesitation, his motions careful, his voice measured as he explained that his wallet was in the inside pocket of his blazer. Briggs didn't respond, just watched closely, jaw tight. When Desmond handed over the documents, Briggs looked over them for less than a second before asking if Desmond had been drinking. He hadn't. Said so plainly. He was coming home from work at the courthouse. He even offered his courthouse badge, kept beside his ID. Briggs ignored it. "Step out of the vehicle," Briggs ordered, his tone more commanding now. Desmond blinked, still holding the wheel. He asked, not in defiance but in steady clarity, what the reason for the stop was. He wanted to understand. Was it a broken taillight? A turn misjudged? Briggs's eyes narrowed. He repeated the command. Desmond's posture remained calm, but a knot had begun to form in his chest. He knew how quickly things could spiral. He raised his hands slowly, stepping out with deliberate movements. His blazer shifted, revealing the faint imprint of the courthouse badge clipped to his belt. It didn't matter. Briggs had already decided who he was. "Turn around." Desmond paused, the edge of disbelief beginning to crack through his restraint. He asked again, quietly, what he was being stopped for. Briggs took a step forward. "Disorderly conduct," he muttered, reaching for the cuffs. There was no scene, no raised voice, no threat of violence. Just the sudden, sharp metal closing around Desmond's wrists, and the finality of it all echoing louder than any outburst could have. Desmond stood still, staring ahead as Briggs pushed him toward the cruiser. As he was turned, his briefcase slipped from the passenger seat. The latch popped open upon impact with the pavement, and its contents scattered. A rainfall of documents, yellow legal pads, and court papers fluttering onto the roadside like leaves. The leather journal landed face down, open to a page where Desmond had written earlier that week. "Dignity is the last line of defense for a man who refuses to be broken." Briggs didn't look back. Desmond caught one last glimpse of his notes through the window before the door slammed shut beside him. In that moment, there was no courtroom, no badge, no law degree in progress. Just the cold interior of a police cruiser and the sound of a man's future being closed out behind a steel door. The siren didn't wail. There was no urgency in the way Briggs drove away, just a casual confidence. A smugness that came from knowing this wouldn't be the first time a man like Desmond Carter was brought in under vague charges that wouldn't hold, but would still stain. It wasn't about guilt. It was about power. Control. Desmond sat stiffly, hands behind his back, feeling the pressure of the cuffs digging into his skin. He kept his gaze forward. He didn't allow himself the dignity of grief. Not yet. Not while the city lights blurred past his window, and a once ordinary night turned into another chapter in a story he'd tried so hard not to become part of. Somewhere behind them, along the side of the road, legal briefs danced in the wind. A page from his journal caught on a street sign, stuck there like a quiet witness, forgotten by the officer, left behind by the man now in custody. A reminder that even the most dignified fall, and when they do, the world often keeps moving, indifferent to the weight of what's been taken. Desmond Carter spent the night in a holding cell that smelled of bleach and rust. The walls were a dull gray, the paint peeling in places, revealing the cold metal beneath. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced across the floor. The bench he sat on was hard and unyielding, offering no comfort. He sat upright, his back straight, trying to maintain a semblance of dignity in a place designed to strip it away. The other inmates eyed him curiously. His calm demeanor, his neatly tied locks, and his composed silence set him apart. Some scoffed, mocking his appearance and quiet nature. One man sneered, questioning if he thought he was better than the rest. Desmond didn't respond. He knew that any reaction could be misconstrued, could escalate into something more. He focused on his breathing, steady and controlled, a technique he'd learned to manage stress during his law studies. Morning came slowly. The guards moved with practiced indifference, calling out names and directing inmates to various holding areas. Desmond was led to a small, windowless room where he met his public defender. The man was disheveled, his tie askew, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He glanced at Desmond's file briefly before launching into a rapid explanation of the charges and the likely outcomes. Desmond listened patiently, interjecting only to clarify certain legal points. He mentioned his background in law, his work as a clerk, and his desire to represent himself. The defender raised an eyebrow, skeptical, but didn't argue. He had too many cases and too little time. Later that day, Desmond was escorted to the courtroom. The hallway leading there was lined with faded photographs of past judges and legal luminaries. He walked past them, his steps measured, his head held high. The courtroom itself was a stark contrast to the holding cell. Wooden benches polished to a shine, the judge's bench elevated and imposing, the seal of justice prominently displayed behind it. Desmond's jail-issued clothes hung loosely on his frame, but he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. As he entered, conversations hushed. The room turned to observe him, a black man with locks, walking with purpose despite his circumstances. He took his place, standing tall, awaiting the proceedings. Officer Ronald Briggs entered shortly after, his uniform crisp, his demeanor smug. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on Desmond's hair. A smirk played on his lips as he approached the bench, whispering something to the judge. The judge, an older man with a weary expression, leaned forward, listening intently. After a brief exchange, he addressed the court, stating that, due to security concerns, Desmond's hair needed to be cut before the hearing could proceed. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Desmond's eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained silent, his posture unchanged. Two guards approached him, clippers in hand. The room watched in stunned silence as they began to shave his head. Strands of his locks fell to the floor, each one a symbol of his identity, his heritage, his journey. Briggs watched with satisfaction, his smirk widening. Desmond didn't flinch. He stared straight ahead, his expression stoic, refusing to give Briggs the satisfaction of seeing him broken. When the guards finished, the floor around Desmond was littered with his hair. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Desmond stood there, now bald but unbowed. His dignity remained intact, a testament to his inner strength and resilience. Desmond Carter sat alone in his cell, the cold steel bench pressing against his back, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on the concrete walls. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant clanging of metal doors and the occasional murmur of voices echoing through the corridors. His hands rested on his knees, fingers interlaced, as he stared at the floor strewn with the remnants of his dignity. His locks, now severed, lay in a heap beside his feet. The weight of humiliation bore down on him, a crushing force that threatened to shatter the composure he had so meticulously maintained. Memories flooded his mind, vivid and unrelenting. He saw his father's hands, calloused yet gentle, weaving through his young son's hair, a ritual of love and pride. "This is your crown," his father had whispered, eyes filled with reverence. "Don't ever let anyone take it from you." The warmth of that moment contrasted sharply with the cold reality of his current state, amplifying the ache in his chest. Word of the incident spread rapidly through the legal community. Some colleagues expressed outrage, their voices rising in protest against the blatant violation of Desmond's rights. Others, however, dismissed it as an unfortunate but necessary measure, citing security protocols and courtroom decorum. A few approached Desmond with veiled concern, suggesting he plead guilty to expedite the process and avoid further scrutiny. Their words, though cloaked in empathy, carried an undertone of resignation, a tacit acceptance of injustice. Desmond listened, nodding politely, but his resolve remained unshaken. He knew that acquiescing would not only betray his principles, but also set a precedent that could embolden further abuses. The system, flawed as it was, had to be challenged from within. Drawing upon his legal training and unwavering sense of justice, he filed a motion to represent himself, asserting his right to self-representation. The judge, visibly perturbed by the audacity of the request, reluctantly agreed to a full hearing, scheduling it for 2 weeks hence. In the days that followed, Desmond immersed himself in preparation. He pored over legal texts, dissected case law, and meticulously crafted his arguments. The cell, once a symbol of confinement, transformed into a sanctuary of purpose. Each page he turned, each note he scribbled, fortified his determination to confront the very system that had sought to diminish him. As the hearing approached, whispers circulated about the man who dared to defy convention. Some viewed him as a foolhardy idealist, others as a beacon of resilience. Desmond, however, remained indifferent to their opinions. He understood that this was not merely about personal vindication, but about challenging a narrative that had long marginalized voices like his. In the quiet moments before the hearing, Desmond stood before the small mirror in his cell, examining his reflection. The absence of his locks was jarring, a stark reminder of the indignity he had endured. Yet, beneath the surface, he saw a man unbroken, his spirit intact. He straightened his posture, adjusted the collar of his shirt, and prepared to face the courtroom, not as a victim, but as a formidable advocate for justice. The transformation was complete. Desmond Carter, once a soft-spoken law clerk, now stood poised to confront the very institutions that had sought to silence him. The courtroom awaited, unaware of the reckoning that was about to unfold. Desmond Carter's days blurred together in a rhythm of solitude and resolve. In the sterile confines of his cell, he had found a purpose, a way to rise above the circumstances that had been thrust upon him. With nothing but his mind to rely on, he turned inward, diving deep into legal texts, using the scant resources available to him. He wrote motions with careful precision, his handwriting deliberate and neat, even when the cell's dim light flickered in protest. Precedents were memorized, legal arguments crafted with the sharpness of a man determined not to let this moment define him, but rather to define the system that had sought to break him. He had no access to law libraries, no way to peruse the legal journals or textbooks he was accustomed to. But in the small moments of quiet, as the hum of the prison settled into the background, Desmond worked. He collected case files, sent letters requesting support and information, and built a network of allies, however sparse they might be. His legal knowledge and sharp mind became his tools, and he wielded them like a craftsman. But the most valuable ally of all came in the form of Jalen, a young black guard working in the prison. Jalen had noticed Desmond's drive, his refusal to crumble, and felt an unspoken connection to him. Quietly, he began sneaking in books, case law, Supreme Court decisions, anything that might help him prepare. Jalen's gestures were small, seemingly inconsequential, but to Desmond they were lifelines. They were reminders that the world outside hadn't forgotten him, and that even in a place designed to isolate, he wasn't entirely alone. Meanwhile, Desmond's name began to circulate. Whispers of his brilliance spread beyond the prison walls, reaching the ears of those who had once mentored him. Judge Harper, a retired figure who had once taken Desmond under his wing, learned of what had happened. The news struck him deeply, igniting a quiet fury in the heart of the old judge, who had seen far too many lives destroyed by injustice. Harper, though now out of the legal circuit, still held sway in certain circles. He called in a favor, leveraging his connections with a federal review board. His quiet actions, done out of sight and out of earshot of most, were beginning to set in motion a chain of events that would ripple outward, reshaping the narrative that had been so neatly controlled by the powers that be. Desmond, unknowingly, had allies in high places, and the fight that was brewing would become far larger than a single man's battle in a courtroom. Outside the prison, Officer Ronald Briggs remained steadfast in his arrogance. He boasted loudly about his actions, dismissing any concerns raised about Desmond's treatment as the exaggerated complaints of a man who had been put in his place. He spoke often to his colleagues, smirking as he recounted the events of the courtroom, convinced that he had humiliated Desmond beyond repair. To him, it was a victory, a lesson for any man who dared to challenge authority. But what Briggs didn't know was that the very thing he had tried to break in Desmond, the pride, the spirit, the fire, had only grown stronger. The prison began to take notice of Desmond. Guards whispered about him as his reputation grew. Some respected him for his intellect, others quietly feared his quiet defiance. It wasn't long before Desmond was moved to a private room for his own safety. The facility had grown aware that Desmond was no ordinary prisoner. He was becoming a symbol of resistance against the very system that had placed him there. And in that quiet room, in the solitude of his new space, Desmond found the time and space to reflect on what had happened, on how far he had come, and on the mountain that lay ahead of him. In the dead of night, as the sounds of the prison faded to a dull murmur, Desmond stood before the small grimy mirror in his room. The reflection staring back at him was different. He was bald now, his locks, once a crown, a symbol of his heritage and his identity, had been taken from him. He reached up, running his fingers over the smooth skin of his scalp, feeling the absence of the hair that had been such a defining part of him. But as his gaze remained fixed on his own eyes, he saw something deeper, a quiet, burning fire. He wasn't broken. The clippers had removed his locks, but they had not touched his soul. His head might be bare, but his resolve was stronger than ever. Desmond closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him, but he wasn't about to let it crush him. "You wanted me broken," he whispered to his reflection, his voice low but firm. "I'm not." His words hung in the stillness of the room, a vow to himself, a promise to his father, a declaration to the system that sought to erase him. The fire within him had not been extinguished, it had only been stoked. And now, as the quiet of the prison surrounded him, Desmond understood something that few had ever grasped. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something greater, for all the lives that had been overlooked, for all the voices that had been silenced, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The morning of the hearing arrived with a palpable sense of anticipation. The air outside the courthouse was thick with tension. Protesters had gathered in droves, their chants rising and falling like waves crashing against a cliff. Signs held high in defiance of the system, their messages bold and unyielding. Justice for Desmond. End racial profiling. We demand accountability. The media was out in full force, Cameras pointed toward the steps as reporters scrambled to capture every moment. The scene outside the courthouse was chaotic, electric, a reflection of the gravity of the situation unfolding inside. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was no less intense. The gallery was packed with spectators, their eyes fixed on the empty bench at the front of the room. Lawyers whispered to one another, the low murmur of their voices blending with the occasional shuffle of paper. The bailiff stood at attention, awaiting the arrival of the judge, but there was an undercurrent of unease in the air. The tension was thick enough to slice through with a knife, and for once it felt like the scales of justice might finally be tipping in the direction of truth. Desmond stood at the defendant's table, his posture erect, the calm determination etched across his face. He wore a dark suit, freshly pressed, his bald head gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His gaze was steady, his thoughts focused, despite the chaotic energy around him. This was his moment. He had fought for this, for his right to stand here, in this space, and demand accountability from those who had wronged him. But even as he stood poised for the hearing to begin, he could not shake the feeling that something was about to shift, something bigger than even he had anticipated. The door to the courtroom opened, and the room fell into a hushed silence. The spectators, the media, even the attorneys, all turned their attention to the entrance. The sight of a federal official walking into the room caused a ripple of confusion. The man was dressed in a dark suit, his expression serious as he walked with purpose toward the front of the room. He stopped at the podium and cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "Due to ethical concerns and complaints filed," the official began, his voice firm but calm, "Judge Raymond has been recused from presiding over this case. A temporary appointment has been made." The words hung in the air like a sudden storm, and the room fell into an eerie silence. The murmurs that followed were low, confused, and tinged with disbelief. Judge Raymond was the one who had been overseeing the case from the start. His recusal was unexpected, unsettling. The questions hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Why was he recused? What was happening behind the scenes? The official turned toward the door, which had remained ajar. A brief pause, then the door swung open, and in the next moment, a figure emerged from behind it. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Desmond Carter, dressed in the black robes of a judge, walked into the room. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Desmond in that moment looked every bit the part. Tall and commanding, the robes flowing around him as he moved with a purpose, his presence larger than life. His expression was composed, but there was an undeniable fire in his eyes, a quiet strength that radiated outwards. The transformation was nothing short of breathtaking. This was not the man who had been humiliated in that same courtroom weeks ago. No, this was a man who had taken control, who had seized his moment, and in doing so, had shifted the very nature of the proceedings. Briggs, sitting in the defendant's chair, froze. His eyes widened, his smug expression faltering as he processed what was happening. The confident, arrogant man who had gleefully described his actions just days before now found himself rendered speechless, his mouth hanging slightly open, unable to grasp the enormity of the situation. Desmond, who had been reduced to a mere pawn in Briggs' eyes, was now the one in charge, the one who would dictate the course of the day. The room erupted in a cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and astonished whispers. The attorneys, the spectators, the reporters, all were in shock, struggling to reconcile the image of the man they had seen in handcuffs just weeks earlier with the figure standing before them now. This wasn't just a temporary appointment, this was a moment of poetic justice unfolding before their eyes. Desmond had gone from victim to victor in a matter of weeks, his quiet resilience now the driving force behind a courtroom that had once turned its back on him. Desmond ascended the bench with a grace that was almost regal, the weight of the moment settling over him like a mantle. He sat, adjusting his robes, and for a long moment he simply surveyed the room. His gaze fell on Briggs, who was still staring at him, wide-eyed and unblinking. Desmond's lips twitched into a faint smile, a smile that held no trace of malice, only quiet triumph. This was not about revenge. This was not about rubbing Briggs's nose in his defeat. This was about ensuring that justice would be served, that the system would finally be held accountable for its actions. The court fell into an uneasy silence as Desmond raised his gavel, the sound of it striking the wood ringing out sharply. He looked out across the room, his voice clear and steady as he called the hearing to order. The shift in power had begun, and there was no turning back. Desmond Carter, once a man silenced by injustice, was now the one holding the reins. And in that moment, as he looked out over the stunned faces in the room, he knew that this was just the beginning. The wheels of change had been set into motion, and they were unstoppable now. The courtroom had grown quiet, but the tension in the air was thick, palpable. Desmond sat high on the bench, his gaze steady as he watched the officers move to call their first witness. The sound of his gavel still lingered in the air, and for a moment it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Desmond could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, some in disbelief, some eager for justice, and others hoping that this moment would pass without any more disruption to the order they'd long known. But Desmond wasn't here to let it pass. He wasn't here for anything but to see it through, all the way to the end. Officer Briggs was called to testify first. His demeanor, once so confident, was now a far cry from what it had been on that day. As he rose, the swagger that had marked his every step seemed to have evaporated. His shoulders were slumped, and his usual smirk was nowhere to be found. Briggs shuffled to the stand, glancing nervously at the judge who had once been a figure of authority over him, now a man who was only a mirror of what he'd tried to break. Desmond's eyes never left Briggs, but there was no gloating in his gaze, no smirk, just the cold, clinical focus of a man determined to uncover the truth. The questions came slowly at first, but they were sharp, precise. Desmond's voice was calm, almost soothing, but his words cut with surgical precision. He began by addressing the inconsistencies in Briggs's report, slowly deconstructing each sentence, every claim made with meticulous care. There was no rush in Desmond's questioning. He didn't need to raise his voice or make grand gestures. He simply spoke, and each word seemed to expose the truth of the situation, one that Briggs was desperate to bury. The arrogance that had once been his shield began to crumble under the weight of Desmond's quiet but relentless scrutiny. Briggs fidgeted in his seat, his hands trembling as he answered the questions. His words grew more disjointed, more defensive with every follow-up. Desmond didn't relent. He asked about the handcuffing, the disorderly conduct, and each time, Briggs's responses became less confident, more stammering. He was no longer the officer who had once walked with his head held high, confident that the system would protect him. Now, he was a man caught in his own lies, struggling to keep the facade intact. Desmond paused for a moment, his gaze never leaving Briggs. He looked over the courtroom, each eye on him, hanging on his every move. The room was still, and in that silence, Desmond could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. But he didn't flinch. He had already come this far. No one was going to silence him now. Desmond called his witnesses next. The bailiff, who had been a silent observer during the entire ordeal, was the first to take the stand. Desmond asked him to recount the details of the incident, the moment when Desmond had been forcibly removed from his car. The bailiff's voice was steady, but there was a hesitation there, an unspoken understanding that what had happened was far from routine. He described the way Desmond had remained calm, composed, despite the aggression he'd faced. The bailiff could not deny it. Desmond had been the model of dignity even in the face of everything that had been done to him. Next was the public defender, a man who had been far too quick to dismiss Desmond's case. He stood with an almost sheepish expression, his previous apathy toward Desmond's plight now evident in the way he stammered through his testimony. Desmond didn't press him too hard. He didn't need to. The defender's words did more harm to his own credibility than Desmond could have ever hoped for. He merely asked, in calm, measured tones, why the legal aid had not taken Desmond's case more seriously from the start. It was clear to the courtroom that the system, which had promised to defend Desmond, had failed him long before the moment in that courtroom. The defender fumbled with his answers, stumbling over excuses, the cracks in the system all too visible now. Finally, Desmond called the officer who had been tasked with bringing the clippers to the scene. The officer's eyes darted around the room nervously as he sat on the stand. He had seen his role in the event as just another task to perform, but now, under Desmond's steady gaze, it felt like the truth was finally pressing down on him. Desmond asked him simple questions. Why the clippers had been brought, who had ordered it, and whether any real safety concern had justified the act. The officer's answers were hesitant, filled with contradictions. It was clear that he hadn't questioned his orders at the time, and now he was realizing the consequences of not doing so. Through it all, Desmond never lost his composure. His voice remained even, his demeanor calm, but every word was a calculated strike. He wasn't here to make a scene. He wasn't here to shout or plead. He was here to expose the truth, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for anyone to deny. And then came the moment that would change everything. Desmond looked up from his notes, and for the first time, a small, knowing smile flickered across his lips. He had one final piece to present. The courtroom, now hanging on his every word, grew still as he reached for a folder beside him. He pulled out a flash drive, holding it up for the room to see, before placing it into the evidence tray. A hushed silence fell over the court as the projector flickered to life, and the image of a security camera feed appeared on the screen. The footage showed Briggs standing in the corner of the holding cell area, watching with an unmistakable grin on his face as Desmond was forcibly shaved. The clip was grainy, but the laughter was audible, low, mocking, and unmistakably cruel. The room went silent. Briggs's face went ashen. His posture slumped, and he lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The smirk that had once defined him, that had brought him so much confidence, was gone. His humiliation was complete. Desmond didn't look at Briggs. He didn't need to. The evidence was irrefutable. The truth was out, and it hung in the air like a dark cloud that would not dissipate. Desmond sat back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the screen, but his mind was already focused on the next step. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The power dynamic had flipped. Desmond had taken control, and now the world would see what he could do with it. Briggs, defeated and silent, had no more answers. The courtroom could only wait for what would come next. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Desmond finished his final statements, the weight of his decision hanging in the air like a thick fog. He took a slow breath, standing tall at the bench, as the room held its collective breath. There was no need for theatrics now, no need for grand speeches. He had already spoken through his actions, through the evidence, through the sharpness of his questions. Desmond's voice, though calm, carried the power of someone who had endured more than most could imagine, yet stood unbroken. With a steady hand, he reviewed the facts one last time, looking directly at Officer Briggs, who sat hunched in his chair, his face drained of color. Desmond's gaze was unwavering, not because he wanted to exact revenge, but because he had something far more important to deliver: justice. The law had been bent and broken, not just in this case, but in the way Desmond had been treated since the moment his hands had been cuffed. It was a quiet injustice that had slithered through the cracks of a system built to protect, but Desmond wasn't about to let it go. He didn't stop there. Desmond knew that this was just one battle in a larger war. The decision was made, but it was only the beginning of the repercussions. He issued a formal complaint to Internal Affairs and recommended a full investigation by the federal ethics boards. This wasn't just a matter of police misconduct, it was a systemic failure. Desmond wasn't about to let it slip by unnoticed, no matter how much power and influence Briggs had. As the ruling was read, the room grew even quieter. The tension was palpable, thick with a mixture of disbelief and awe. Desmond had done what no one had expected. He had turned the tables on the very system that had been built to suppress him. And then, as though the final act of this justice was nothing more than a natural conclusion, Desmond ordered Briggs to surrender his badge right there in the courtroom. It wasn't just symbolic, it was a statement. Briggs's career, his power, and his influence evaporated in an instant. The room watched in stunned silence as Briggs, too proud to say a word, simply stood and handed over his badge, the object of his former authority, now a symbol of his disgrace. Desmond didn't flinch as Briggs left the stand, his shoulders sagging, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. There was no victory dance for Desmond, no sense of triumph in his chest. His job wasn't done. It had only just begun. But for now, justice had been served. Desmond took a deep breath and stood, his gavel in hand, his demeanor still, almost tranquil. His decision had been made not just for him, but for all those who had been silenced by the weight of the system for far too long. When the court finally adjourned, Desmond walked out from behind the bench. The sounds of the courtroom faded into the background as he stepped toward the exit, his footsteps steady and resolute. The door opened, and the sudden rush of air from the outside world hit him like a physical blow. The cold, crisp air of the morning seemed to cut through the lingering heat of the courtroom, but Desmond's focus was clear. As he emerged into the street, the world outside was waiting for him. The protesters were gathered in silent rows, their signs held high, their faces a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Reporters stood poised with cameras, eager to capture this moment, but there was no cheer, no fanfare. Desmond was not greeted as a hero. Instead, there was an undeniable silence. The onlookers didn't shout his name or raise their fists in victory. They simply watched. Some eyes were full of admiration, others filled with curiosity. Desmond wasn't here for applause, wasn't here for the spotlight. He had never asked for it. Standing before the gathered crowd, Desmond felt something shift within him. There was no sense of gloating, no desire to bask in the justice he had secured. He didn't need validation. What mattered now was the weight of the truth, the quiet power that came from standing firm in the face of adversity, knowing that he had done the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. As the cameras snapped pictures, the crowd remained still. Desmond paused for a long moment, looking over the sea of faces before him, before stepping forward and addressing them all. His voice, though soft, carried an undeniable weight. His words cut through the silence, simple but powerful. This isn't revenge. This is truth. And it was long overdue. The words hung in the air, resonating with every person in the crowd. It wasn't a rallying cry. It wasn't a plea for sympathy. It was a declaration. A quiet affirmation of something far more important than victory, truth. The kind that had been buried for too long, that had been ignored for too long, but now, in this moment, was laid bare for all to see. Desmond stood there, his eyes unwavering, as the crowd began to stir. The protests, the cameras, the noise, they were no longer the focus. It was the truth that mattered now, the truth that had cut through the lies and the defenses. The power had shifted, not through force, but through the quiet, unyielding strength of one man's commitment to what was right. Desmond had not been broken. He had only grown stronger. And as he stood there, staring into the eyes of the world, he knew that this was just the beginning. The system had not defeated him. He had, in fact, begun to unravel it, and nothing was going to stop him from seeing it through to the end. Weeks passed, and the world outside had moved on from the courtroom drama, but Desmond remained a fixture in the quiet corners of the legal world he had fought to reshape. Today, he sat on a bench just outside the courthouse, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the smooth edge of a letter in his lap. The weight of it was subtle, yet it seemed to carry the kind of significance that only time and truth could give. He had arrived there early, dressed in his own suit now, a stark contrast to the prison-issued clothes he had worn not long ago. The suit was sharp, the fit perfect. It wasn't a symbol of triumph, but of a quiet new beginning, a fresh start where the lines between his past and future had blurred, weaving together into something undeniable. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the courthouse steps, bathing the scene in a soft amber glow. It was late afternoon, and the air held a certain crispness to it, a hint of change. Desmond's face, once tense and burdened with a weight few could imagine, now looked more at ease, though the faint lines of exhaustion still traced his features. He was at peace in a way that had eluded him for a long time, before the courtrooms, before the scandal, and even before the fight for justice he had waged. Now the truth had not only set him free, it had given him a life he was beginning to embrace with a sense of purpose he hadn't fully realized before. Jalen approached, his steps quick but not hurried. The young guard had changed too. His posture was taller now, more confident, and there was a fire in his eyes that had only sparked after seeing Desmond's fight up close. Jalen had been applying to law schools with Desmond's help, a mentorship that had developed over the weeks as their bond deepened. The transition from guard to aspiring lawyer had been one Jalen embraced eagerly, buoyed by the notion that the world, as unjust as it could be, still held room for change, for redemption. As he sat beside Desmond, their conversation was comfortable, but quiet. Both men settled into the kind of camaraderie that spoke more of understanding than words. The letter in Desmond's hands finally trembled as he peeled open the envelope, the crisp paper almost pristine in its simplicity. He held it up for a moment, reading the words that would shift the direction of his mission. It was a scholarship grant from a foundation focused on helping Black youth break into the legal field. Desmond's eyes lingered on the words, feeling the familiar rush of hope rise within him. This was more than just financial support. It was a tangible affirmation of what he had set out to do. The foundation had approved his program, a vision that had blossomed from the very work he had done during his trial. It would create an avenue for Black youth, many of whom came from communities where the legal system had failed them, to not only enter, but thrive in the field. He couldn't help but smile, a subtle curve of his lips, not out of pride, but with the understanding that something real was starting to take shape. Desmond folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his gaze drifting back toward Jalen. The young man's excitement was palpable, though it was the kind of quiet excitement that didn't need to be shouted. The weight of their shared mission hung in the air between them, two men, both shaped by the failures of a broken system, now poised to change it in their own way. Jalen's face lit up as he turned to Desmond. The unspoken thanks passed between them with ease. Desmond had given him more than just guidance. He had given him hope. Hope that there were still opportunities for someone like him to rise above the confines of a system that was never meant to let him rise at all. But the moment wasn't all about what was to come. Desmond reached into his bag, pulling out a small velvet box. It was unassuming at first, the kind of thing anyone might overlook. But to Desmond, it was the culmination of a long and painful journey. He opened the box slowly, revealing the locks he had once worn proudly. They had been cut off in front of the courtroom, the very symbol of who he was and what had been taken from him. But now, those locks were preserved in the velvet lining, a quiet memorial to his father's words. "This is your crown. Don't ever let anyone take it from you." Desmond stared at them for a long moment, not with sadness, but with peace. His father's memory lingered in those locks, in the legacy they represented. But more than that, they symbolized a victory not just over what had been taken, but over what he had found within himself. In the act of having them forcibly shaved away, Desmond had been forced to confront something deeper, his own resilience, his own ability to stand firm in the face of anything that sought to break him. He hadn't lost his crown. It had simply been